there. Some of these things I'm going to tell you, just some foundings from some experts, are things that you've heard before. So forgive me if you've heard them before. Jeff, you've already mentioned a couple of things that I've going to mention. I'll probably mention them again. But I started a workshop. I was in a workshop at one time with a young woman who started the session by saying, and I'm now going to ask you the same question, how many of you enjoy giving to charities for which you care? Hands up. Gosh, I hope all hands go up. Okay, good. How many of you enjoy asking for money of charities that you really the number reduces significantly, have you noticed? And that's the problem. I've been there, I know the feeling. I still am squeamish about going to ask someone for money, and at the National Foundation, I've had some meetings with some big people who've given big bucks, and it turned out to be a lot of fun. I promise you, it really did. But that thought of asking another human being to get into sort of their private business about asking for funds is not a comfortable concept, at least initially. I was on the Butler University board a few years ago, and I was board chairman at the time, and I made a speech asking for capital funds. We had a large capital campaign, a couple $100 million. And so I made an impassioned speech to the board members, and two of the board members offered their resignation the next day. So I just want to warn you, that when you talk about money, and I understand all of this is relative. Some people are blessed and have a lot of money. Some people are at a certain stage in their life when they're putting kids through school or whatever the story is. We're all in different situations. So when we ask you to give, we're asking you to think. One of the words that's used sometimes is sacrificially, but at least thinking about this campaign, and especially with your responsibility as being a board member. The old saying about time, talent, and treasure. We've all known a number of boards. I've been on small boards and big boards, and we have members on boards that we've been on where they think as they walk in the room, they bless us with their presence, and their vast knowledge is all they need to bring to the board. If you look up any definition of what a not-for-profit board is, it starts with money. After all, that's what we do. It's a not-for-profit. So one of the things we have to do is not be apologetic about the fact that we need money needs to be part of our formula and what we do. What is expected? Again, this happens. Again, we all have our own stories. I have to share mine, and so you have to listen to mine tonight. But I remember when I was first on that same board, I was talking about the Butler board. The board chairman during this campaign said, "I want to congratulate all you board members. You've been very, very generous." And I went home that night going, "Yeah, I was pretty daggone generous." I wrote a check for $5,000, which at the time was the largest check I'd ever written to any charity. This was a number of years ago, and I thought I was pretty daggone good at $5,000 because after all, the chairman had told me. The fact is that once I got into the campaign and started seeing what people were giving, it wasn't so generous, but I had no frame of reference, and that's the same with us. We have to give to the extent we possibly can, be convinced the program's going to work, and what we're trying to do is going to work. So again, we all learn this in various ways on this program. Another thing that's unusual about our situation tonight is that Glenn, through his tremendous efforts, has gotten way ahead of the game. He's raised a lot of money already. It surprised me when I was part of the team that went to United Way a few weeks ago that they came back, as we all know, with a $500,000 grant. It was not a surprise that the $500,000 grant was given, although it was a very pleasant answer. But it was a surprise to me that the board had not given as much money as is normally required for that kind of gift to be considered. Normally, these boards that are giving out money, giving grants, are saying we have to have 100% participation from our board, and we need to have substantial giving by our board. And we just simply aren't there yet. Some of you have been generous, and some of you have not yet because you haven't asked. We haven't really mounted the campaign, and that's, I think, where we are now. But just understand, we're doing exceptionally well in terms of money that we have to now match. I think it's about $850,000 simply to match the two other funds. They're required amounts. Then over and above that, we have some additional money that Glenn can share about building the buildings, finishing up, doing the things that we want to do. So we're on an outstanding direction, but we have a long way to go. Some findings about campaigns that I wanted to share with you, mostly from a guy named Jim Langley. Jim's written a couple of books on giving. He has worked for a number of universities, headed up their development staff, and is a really interesting guy. He collects data on giving all the time. Some of the things that he has shared with me and others that are somewhat contrary to what people sometimes think. Number one, 90% of all gifts, in fact a little over 90% of all gifts, are given by people. They're not given by corporations. They're not given by other organizations. Sometimes when we do brainstorming, people say, oh, let's go to such and such corporation, they're loaded. Well, corporations have a profit motivation, they have a duty, and they don't give that much money. 90+% of people are the ones who give to campaigns. So there's no shortcut. It takes our friends, it takes asking our friends, it takes talking to them, updating them, telling them why. One of the things that Jim Langley says, for instance, is before he makes a major gift request, he's had 11 touches with that person. A touch doesn't necessarily mean a lunch. It may mean a birthday card. It may mean running into them at the game and visiting. Whatever it is, it takes touches for people to feel comfortable that what you're asking for is credible and that they want to be a part of it. Another excuse sometimes used in raising money is, well, I'm not going to ask this person because they have nothing to do with our program. They don't understand anything about it. In the university world, Jim used the example of the University of California at San Diego. A number of years ago, mounted a campaign of almost $500 million. And the findings in that community were that almost 95% of all the giving was by people who had nothing to do with the university. So obviously, people who've been in the scouting program are more connected, but we can't be apologetic or resigned to the fact that we can't go to other people who see what an incredible job the scouting program does to build character and to create leadership values for young men and women. Small donors can be large donors. This is a thing that happens. Jim actually has a statement that sounds just unbelievably extreme, but he says, based on studies, people who give as little as $100 a year for at least 15 years are the best single candidates they have for giving $1 million. 100 a year, and all of a sudden, but the translation is that people are in the habit of giving. They know what's going on. They've been there long term. One of the specific examples was a couple out on the East Coast who had no children, who gave religiously $500, no pun intended there, $500 a year to Georgetown University. He died, and then she died shortly thereafter, and so Georgetown was pleasantly surprised when they received $25 million from a couple that had given only $500 a year for all of their lifetime. So another rule that we throw out, or assumption that we throw out, is that they've never given much money. We don't want to ask them for a capital campaign, because you never know when that kind of couple might show up. Another thing that we see it, whether it's the United Way, name your charity. I'm not going to pick on a whole bunch of them. I just picked on United Way. I shouldn't, but people don't trust institutions anymore. They don't just blindly give $10,000 or $100,000, pick a number, to an institution. They want to know where it's going to go, what it's going to do, why you need it. They want specificity, and if they can't find out what that is, they may not give it to you. Or they may give a gift to you that says, yeah, I'll give you money, but it's going to go right here. It's going to go to this kind of person who does this kind of thing. So another assumption that we make that we need to overcome. The other part of that, in my opinion, is really important because people know scouting. They don't know it as well as we sometimes think they do. They don't know modern scouting versus when I was a boy. But they know at least the idea of scouting. We need to also answer the very important question of why. Why are we building this building? Is it just, it's out in the middle of nowhere? You're gonna have a few campers get in there, and I understand the storm part, but why do we need to do this? Why do we need to spend this kind of money? And there's a very compelling answer, obviously, but if we don't tell it, then again, people don't trust institutions to just say, give us the money because we want the money and we think you're great guys. They just simply don't do that anymore. Why do we do it? Well, a couple of examples I was trying to think of why we give, why I give. One example is I was a camp counselor. This happens to be a YMCA story. I was also a Boy Scout, but just happened to fit this. I'm from Evansville, Indiana, originally. I'm in Evansville, and somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, excuse me, you're Craig Fenneman, aren't you? I said, yes, I am. He said, weren't you a camp counselor at Camp Carson? And I said, well, yes, I was. He said, oh man, I love Camp Carson. And over the next 2 minutes, he told me the name of his counselor, his assistant counselor, the name of the cook, the flavor of the bug juice he had, the classes he took, the songs they sang at camp, all that kind of thing. He was done after, like I say, probably 2 minutes. It sort of felt like 10 because the details kept flowing. And at the end of his little presentation, I said, gosh, that's wonderful. How many years did you go to camp? He said, I went to patrol boy camp for 2.5 days one time. This is a 35-year-old guy who's embedded in his mind is this experience that changed his life profoundly. And that's what you guys and girls know we do all the time in the scouting program and in terms of the camp. So that's one of the big whys. Why do we do it? We can't assume people know who we are and what we do. I used to be in the restaurant business and every franchise business, and of every dollar I ever earned, 5% of it went into marketing. I didn't assume, this was Taco Bell, we didn't assume that people knew what our product was and how it tasted and what was new and what wasn't new. 5% of every dollar we ever did. In the Boy Scouts, we're guilty of saying, well, you know, everybody knows what Scouts is, we don't have to worry about that. So that's another thing that when we're asking for money, when we're talking to people, we need to tell them why we're doing it and what we're about now. The other thing that occurs to me that's really obvious, but sometimes we forget, is we're here on the shoulders of others. That camp didn't get there on its own. Somebody bought it or got it. I don't know how the land was obtained. The buildings that are on it were built by our forefathers. Those programs and everything else, all the physical plant is there. And so in a way, it's just our time. It's not just something we have to do, it's something we want to do, because if we're going to continue this program, that's what we're going to have to do. And speaking of a board, the newest trends in university giving, and universities are sort of universities and churches are sort of the place you go to for fundraising. Lots of other organizations do a good job, but universities are probably number one in sophistication. They now look to board contributions for the total campaign. Pick a number. I mean, it could be a $100 million campaign, or 10 million, or 2 million, whatever it is. And the approach that universities now take, look to the board for 15 to 20% of the total giving. So our challenge in this room, right today and in the future, is to try to get all of you to give at that level to get this thing over the hump. So that's a big number. It's a big number, but if the leaders, you are the leaders, obviously, the acknowledged leaders of the organization are not able to give, then others won't give. As was discussed earlier, one of the first things that granting institutions normally do is, do you have 100% participation from your board, and how much money do you have from your board? Because if the board's not in it, why do we care? If the board doesn't care, why should we give a lot of money? Last thing I want to say is, from my perspective, the initial embarrassment that I talked about in the beginning about who doesn't feel real comfortable in giving, I can tell you that my relationships I've had with people that have given me direction on my giving, to Boy Scouts and other organizations, I've really come to appreciate. They help take my values and what I was thinking about and give direction to it. You know, I know you believe in character building, so why don't we do this? Or I know you believe in this particular part of the scouting program, or you really like this part of the building. If you came from the waterfront, you're a waterfront director when you were a kid. Those kinds of things are part of what is done in fundraising.